Before dawn on June 6, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood in the operations room of his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, 20 kilometers west of Paris. The 68-year-old commander had been awake since 3 in the morning, hunched over maps of the French coast as fragmentary reports filtered in through telephone lines and radio transmissions. Somewhere in the darkness over Normandy, Allied paratroopers were dropping from the sky. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The invasion everyone had expected was finally here. Rundstedt was an old Prussian, a professional soldier from a military family that traced its service back generations. He understood what these airborne landings meant. This was not a diversion. This was not a feint. The seaborne assault would follow within hours, and when it came, the beaches of Normandy would be transformed into the decisive battlefield of the war. He picked up the telephone and made the call that should have changed everything. He contacted Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command in Germany, and requested immediate authority to deploy the armoured reserves. 2 Panzer divisions, the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr, sat in the Paris area, roughly 120 miles from the Normandy coast. If they moved now, before dawn, under cover of darkness, they could reach the invasion beaches before the Allies consolidated their beachhead. They could smash into the landing forces while they were most vulnerable, while they were still wading through surf and scrambling up sand, before they could bring their overwhelming material superiority to bear. The answer came back from OKW: permission denied. Those divisions could not be released without Adolf Hitler's personal authorization. And Hitler was asleep at the Berghof, his residence in the Bavarian Alps. His standing orders were clear. No one was to wake him. Rundstedt, the senior field marshal in the German army, the man responsible for defending 2,000 miles of European coastline, could only wait. The clock was ticking. Allied troops were already boarding landing craft in the English Channel, and the one man who could authorize the counterattack that might stop them was lying in bed, untouchable, while the fate of Europe hung in the balance. This is the documented story of how bureaucratic paralysis and authoritarian command structure transformed what might have been Germany's best chance to repel the D-Day invasion into a catastrophic delay. It is a story verified through military records, commander testimony, and historical analysis. It reveals how the concentration of decision-making power in a single individual, combined with a staff too terrified to act without explicit permission, cost Germany the initiative in the most important battle of the war. The numbers tell part of the story, the consequences tell the rest. By the spring of 1944, everyone knew the Allied invasion of France was coming. The only questions were when and where. For years, the Germans had been preparing their answer, a system of coastal fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain that Hitler called the Atlantic Wall. In November 1943, he appointed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to oversee the strengthening of these defences. Rommel arrived to find construction far behind schedule, concrete gun emplacements unfinished, minefields incomplete, and beach obstacles inadequate. He drove his engineers mercilessly, understanding that whatever happened on the beaches would decide everything. But the Atlantic Wall was only half the German defensive strategy. The other half rested on the Panzer divisions, Germany's armoured striking force. If the Allies managed to get ashore, it would be the Panzers that would drive them back into the sea. The question that consumed the German High Command throughout the spring of 1944 was how best to employ these precious armoured reserves. It was a debate that would expose fundamental disagreements about military doctrine, reveal personality conflicts at the highest levels of command, and ultimately doom any coordinated response when the invasion finally came. Rommel had learned bitter lessons in North Africa about operating under Allied air superiority. He knew what happened to armoured columns that tried to move in daylight when enemy aircraft controlled the skies. He had watched his tanks burn on the desert roads, destroyed by fighter bombers before they ever reached the battlefield. Based on this experience, Rommel advocated a strategy of forward defence. He wanted the Panzer divisions positioned close to the coast, where they could immediately counterattack any landing force. His theory was straightforward. The Allies would be weakest in the first hours after landing, disorganized and vulnerable, before they could establish proper defensive positions or bring their naval guns to bear effectively. German armor had to strike in that critical window, driving the invaders back into the water before they could consolidate. After the first 48 hours, Rommel believed, it would be too late. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Rommel's superior as Commander-in-Chief West, held a completely different view. Rundstedt came from the classical German military tradition, trained in the wars of maneuver that had defined German military thinking since the 19th century. He advocated defense in depth, holding the Panzer divisions back from the coast as a powerful central reserve. Once the Allies revealed their main landing site, this concentrated armor would unleash a devastating counterattack that would destroy the invasion before it could expand inland. Rundstedt worried that positioning tanks near the coast would leave them vulnerable to naval bombardment from Allied battleships and destroyers, whose guns could shatter armored formations with impunity. He had seen it happen at Salerno in 1943, where naval gunfire had devastated German counterattacks. The debate was not merely academic. General Lehr von Schweppenberg, who commanded Panzer Group West, the overall armoured command in France, strongly supported Rundstedt's position. Gerd believed that dispersing the panzers along the coast would fritter away Germany's limited armour in local tactical actions, preventing the kind of massive operational counterstroke that could decide the campaign. Tank General Heinz Guderian, the legendary architect of German blitzkrieg doctrine, also weighed in during a breakfast meeting with Hitler in January 1944. Guderian argued that Rommel's plan to bring panzer reserves close to the coast would prevent their rapid redeployment if the Allies landed somewhere else. The tanks would be locked in place, unable to shift quickly to meet the real threat. The arguments grew heated. Part of the tension stemmed from professional jealousy and class prejudice. Rundstedt and Gerd were aristocrats from old Prussian military families. Rommel came from a middle-class background, the son of a schoolteacher. Rundstedt privately dismissed him as one of Hitler's officers, over-promoted by Nazi propaganda, lacking the strategic sophistication for high command. Rommel, for his part, had no patience for theoretical discussions disconnected from battlefield reality. He had seen what Allied air power could do. He knew that elegant plans for mobile warfare meant nothing if your tanks were burning wrecks before they travelled 10 kilometres. In March 1944, Hitler summoned his commanders to a conference at his mountain retreat at Obersalzberg. The procession of field marshals and generals arrived in their staff cars. Rommel and Rundstedt greeted individually by the Führer before being ushered to lunch. Over Arabian coffee, shipped at great risk through British-controlled waters, Hitler heard both positions. Initially, he seemed to side with Rommel. Then, after protests from Rundstedt, he reversed himself. On March 21, he announced his compromise decision. 3 Panzer divisions would go to Army Group B under Rommel's command as a mobile reserve. 4 others, including the elite 1st SS Panzer, 12th SS Panzer, 17th SS Panzer Grenadier, and Panzer Lehr divisions, would form Panzer Group West under the direct control of OKW. They could be released only with Hitler's personal authorization. It was a Solomon solution that split the baby in half and satisfied no one. Rommel did not have enough armour to execute his forward defence strategy. Rundstedt did not have the concentrated striking force necessary for his massive counterattack. Worse, the compromise created a catastrophic command structure. Hitler had reserved to himself personal authority over the divisions that would be critical to stopping any invasion. No one else could deploy them. Not Rundstedt, who commanded all German forces in the West. Not Rommel, who would face the invasion on the ground. Only Hitler. By April 1944, only one of Rommel's 3 assigned Panzer divisions had actually moved into the Normandy sector. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen, was a reconstituted formation, hastily rebuilt after the original division had been destroyed in North Africa. It contained about 2,000 veterans from the Afrika Korps who had been sent home early to recover from wounds or disease, mixed with new recruits and foreign volunteers. The division was equipped with Panzer IV medium tanks and a remarkable collection of improvised self-propelled guns created by Major Alfred Becker, who had converted captured French vehicles into mobile artillery platforms. While the 21st Panzer was a capable formation, it was alone in immediate striking distance of the most likely invasion beaches. The other Panzer divisions under OKW reserve sat farther from the coast. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr Division were positioned near Paris, roughly 120 miles from Normandy. These were formidable units. The 12th SS consisted of young men drawn from the Hitler Youth, born in 1926, led by veteran officers from the 1st SS Panzer Division. Panzer Lehr was an elite formation, created from training and demonstration troops, fully equipped with Panthers and Panzer IVs, its mechanized infantry transported entirely in armoured half-tracks. Both divisions represented the cream of German armoured strength, and both sat under Hitler's direct control. The command structure created a bureaucratic labyrinth. If Allied forces landed in Normandy, Rommel would need these divisions immediately. But Rommel did not command them. Rundstedt commanded OB West, but even he could not deploy these OKW reserves without permission. That authority rested solely with Hitler, 600 miles away in Bavaria, surrounded by staff officers who had learned that the most dangerous thing one could do in the Third Reich was deliver bad news or make decisions without explicit approval. Throughout May 1944, as Allied preparations reached their climax across the English Channel, the German High Command remained divided and uncertain. Rundstedt still believed the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, where the channel was narrowest. Rommel increasingly suspected Normandy, at least as a major diversionary attack. He requested additional panzer divisions be moved closer to the Normandy coast. Rundstedt and OKW refused. The divisions had to remain centrally positioned to respond wherever the Allies struck. No one wanted to commit Germany's limited armour to the wrong location. On the evening of June 5, 1944, Hitler was at the Berghof, his alpine retreat above Berchtesgaden. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost festive. A group of guests and military aides gathered in the complex's tea house, where Hitler held forth on his favourite topics. The great men of history, Europe's future under German domination, his visions for post-war reconstruction. Hitler and his entourage watched newsreels, discussed films and theatre. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was there. So was Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress. They stayed up until 3 a.m, trading reminiscences. It was almost like the old times, Goebbels would later recall, before the Eastern Front became a meat grinder, before Germany began losing the war it had started. When the party finally broke up, a thunderstorm rolled through the mountains. Hitler went to bed around 3 a.m. He was a notorious night owl, his sleep schedule increasingly erratic as the war turned against Germany. His physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had been treating him with a cocktail of drugs, amphetamines to energize him during the day, barbiturates to help him sleep at night. The combination, along with other medications for various ailments real and imagined, had left Hitler's health deteriorating and his judgment impaired. But regardless of his condition, one fact was absolute. Hitler's standing orders were clear. No one was to wake him. His staff had learned this lesson through bitter experience. By this point in the war, Hitler's headquarters had evolved into something that resembled a cult more than a military command structure. His staff were no longer advisors who would tell him difficult truths. They were sycophants who had learned that contradicting the Führer brought only rage, humiliation, and potential dismissal. Better to wait, to stall, to hope someone else would take responsibility. Better to let the disaster unfold than to be the one who woke Hitler with news he did not want to hear. This culture of fear and paralysis would have catastrophic consequences when the invasion finally came. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the greatest military operation in human history was already in motion. More than 150,000 American, British, and Canadian troops were preparing to storm the beaches of Normandy. 5,000 ships were assembled for the crossing. 11,000 aircraft would provide air support. The Allies had spent years preparing for this moment, stockpiling equipment, training soldiers, conducting elaborate deception operations to convince the Germans the invasion would strike at the Pas de Calais. Now, despite terrible weather that had delayed the operation by 24 hours, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had given the order. Operation Overlord was underway. Shortly after midnight on June 6, the first Allied troops arrived over Normandy. American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped into the countryside behind Utah Beach. British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division landed east of Caen, their mission to seize bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal. In a dramatic coup de main, men from the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, landing in 6 gliders, captured the Orne bridges intact. These airborne operations were designed to secure the flanks of the seaborne assault and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches quickly. German radar stations detected the approaching aircraft. Coastal observation posts reported parachutes descending through the darkness. At Hitler's Lehr headquarters in East Prussia and at OKW headquarters near Berchtesgaden, duty officers began receiving fragmentary reports of airborne landings. But the picture was confused. Where exactly were the paratroopers landing? How many were there? Was this the real invasion, or was it a diversion preceding the main assault at Calais? Allied deception operations had been so successful that German intelligence remained convinced the Pas de Calais would be the primary target. Everything else had to be a feint. At Rundstedt's headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the old field marshal was already awake, studying the reports as they came in. Unlike many of his colleagues, Rundstedt immediately grasped what was happening. Airborne landings on this scale were not a diversion. They presaged a major seaborne assault. He looked at his maps and calculated the logistics. If Allied forces were landing paratroopers inland from the Normandy coast, the invasion fleet had to be approaching those same beaches. There was no other explanation. The real invasion was coming, not at Calais, at Normandy. And it was coming now. Rundstedt made his decision quickly. He had 2 Panzer divisions within potential striking distance, the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr. If they moved immediately, departing before dawn, they could travel the 120 miles to Normandy under cover of darkness and the early morning overcast. They might reach the beaches before the Allies fully consolidated their landing, while the invaders were still vulnerable, still disorganized, still establishing their defensive positions. This was the moment for the decisive counterattack that German doctrine had always envisioned. This was the chance to destroy the invasion at its inception. But there was a problem. Those divisions were not under Rundstedt's command. They belonged to OKW Reserve. Only Hitler could authorize their deployment. Rundstedt picked up the telephone and contacted OKW. He did not request permission. He demanded it. He laid out the situation with professional clarity. The airborne landings were too extensive to be a diversion. A major seaborne assault would follow within hours. The Panzer divisions needed to move now, immediately, while darkness still provided some protection from Allied air power. Every hour of delay would make the Allied beachhead stronger and the German counterattack more difficult. The staff officers at OKW received Rundstedt's request. They understood its urgency, but they faced an insurmountable obstacle. Hitler was sleeping, and no one dared wake him. His adjutants hesitated, knowing the Führer's temper, knowing that waking him with incomplete information, or what might turn out to be a false alarm, could trigger a volcanic rage. Throughout the early hours of June 6, as dawn began breaking over Normandy and Allied landing craft approached the beaches, Hitler slept on. And the 2 Panzer divisions that might have made a difference remained in their assembly areas near Paris, awaiting orders that could not be given. At 7:30 in the morning, OKW finally sent its response to Rundstedt. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the OKW operations staff, informed the field marshal that the 2 Panzer divisions could not be committed until Hitler gave the order. And Hitler was still sleeping. His normal routine was to wake around 11 in the morning. Until then, the divisions would have to wait. Rundstedt, the senior field marshal in the German army, the man commanding 60 divisions spread across Western Europe, had to countermand his own orders. The Panzers would not move. The sun rose over Normandy at approximately 5:50 in the morning. The weather was overcast, low clouds providing some cover for German forces on the ground. If the Panzer divisions had been allowed to move at the time Rundstedt initially requested, they would have been travelling during these crucial hours of reduced visibility, when Allied fighter bombers would have had difficulty finding and attacking them. Instead, they sat in their marshalling areas, tank crews waiting beside their machines, wondering why they were not advancing toward the sound of battle that they knew was beginning on the coast. At 6:30 in the morning, the first waves of Allied troops stormed ashore on the Normandy beaches. Americans hit Utah and Omaha. British and Canadians landed at Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Omaha Beach, German defenders from the 352nd Infantry Division put up fierce resistance, inflicting terrible casualties on the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But on the other beaches, Allied forces pushed inland with less opposition than they had feared. Engineers began clearing obstacles. Vehicles rolled ashore. The beachhead was expanding. Only one German Panzer division responded during these critical morning hours. The 21st Panzer Division under General Edgar Feutinger was positioned near Cayenne, about 20 miles from the coast. But even this response was hampered by the Byzantine command structure. Feutinger himself was not at his post. Like so many German commanders that morning, he was away from the front. Sources suggest he was in Paris, spending time with his mistress. When news of the invasion reached him, he had to race back to Normandy. In his absence, his subordinate commanders took the initiative, engaging British paratroopers who had landed near their positions. As dawn broke and Allied forces landed on the beaches north of Caen, General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, wanted the 21st Panzer Division to disengage from fighting the paratroopers and drive immediately toward the beaches. But the division was under Army Group B, which meant Marx needed Rommel's permission, and Rommel was not there either. He had driven to Germany on June 5 to celebrate his wife's birthday and to meet with Hitler, hoping to lobby for additional resources for his defences. Rommel would not learn about the invasion until later that morning. When Marx tried to get authorization through Rommel's chief of staff, Colonel Hans Speidel, the bureaucratic delays consumed precious hours. The 21st Panzer Division finally received permission to attack shortly after noon on June 6. By then, the morning's overcast had begun to clear. Allied fighter bombers and naval artillery could now target any German movement with devastating effect. Nevertheless, the division advanced toward the coast, its tank regiment and Panzergrenadier battalions pushing through British positions. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, elements of the division actually reached the Channel coast between Sword and Juno beaches, driving a wedge between British and Canadian landing forces. It was a remarkable achievement, the only German armoured counterattack to reach the sea on D-Day. But the 21st Panzer could not hold its position. It lacked infantry support. It faced concentrated fire from Allied naval guns offshore, and at 9 in the evening, British gliders began landing nearby as part of Operation Mallard, reinforcing the airborne bridgehead. General Major Feutinger, who had finally returned to his command post, watched this massive glider assault descending from the sky and made a fateful decision. Fearing that his division might be cut off and surrounded, he ordered his forces to withdraw from the coast back to defensive positions on Perrier's Ridge south of Caen. The one German counterattack that had actually reached the beaches on D-Day ended with a retreat. Throughout the morning, while the 21st Panzer struggled to respond, and while Rundstedt's requested reinforcements sat immobile near Paris, Hitler remained asleep at the Berghof. German military intelligence continued receiving reports of Allied landings. Staff officers debated whether this was the real invasion or an elaborate diversion. The prevailing view, encouraged by Allied deception operations, was that Normandy was a feint. The main assault had to be coming at Calais. Hitler had to be convinced of this when he finally woke. Otherwise, he might release the OKW Panzer reserves to Normandy, leaving them unavailable when the real invasion struck in the Pas de Calais. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, arrived at the Berghof around 10 in the morning. Hitler was still sleeping. Finally, sometime around noon, Hitler was awakened and informed of the invasion. According to multiple accounts, his reaction was not what anyone expected. He was not angry. He was not vindictive. He seemed almost relieved. The months of waiting were over. The Allies had finally committed themselves. Now they were in reach of German guns, no longer safely gathering strength in England beyond the Luftwaffe's diminished capacity to strike them. Hitler's reaction suggests how completely Allied deception had succeeded. He believed the Normandy landings were likely a diversion. He had said publicly that Normandy was a possible invasion site, so he could claim vindication for his strategic insight. But he remained convinced that the main blow would come at Calais. The weather was poor, which he thought favoured the defence, and he held Allied troops in contempt, considering them inferior to German soldiers. When informed that the Allies were landing in Normandy, Hitler reportedly said, "The news could not be better." At a lunchtime conference, Hitler finally addressed Rundstedt's request to release the OKW Panzer reserves. After hearing arguments from his staff, he gave his approval. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division were authorized to move toward Normandy. It was approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. More than 12 hours had passed since Rundstedt first requested their deployment. 12 hours during which Allied forces had streamed ashore, established beachheads, and begun consolidating their positions. The timing was disastrous. When Rundstedt had first ordered the panzers to move, it was still dark. The morning brought heavy overcast, providing concealment. By mid-afternoon on June 6, the clouds had broken. Allied aircraft now dominated the skies over Normandy. The two panzer divisions began their approach march and immediately came under devastating air attack. Allied fighter bombers, operating with near impunity, struck German columns moving along the roads. Tanks were forced to pull into roadside woods and wait for darkness. Supply vehicles burned. The advance became a crawl. Panzer Lehr, commanded by General Fritz Bayerlein, began its march from its assembly area near Chartres. The division had to cover more than 100 miles to reach the Normandy battlefront. Under normal conditions, with freedom of movement, armoured units could cover this distance in several hours. But these were not normal conditions. Allied aircraft attacked relentlessly. The division was forced to halt and disperse repeatedly to avoid annihilation from the air. Bayerlein would later report that the advance to Normandy cost him 5 tanks, 84 half-tracks and other armoured vehicles, and approximately 500 killed or wounded, all before his division had fired a shot in combat. The 12th SS Panzer Division faced similar difficulties. Ordered forward at 2:30 in the afternoon, the division could not complete its concentration and begin moving until late in the day. Young soldiers of the Hitler Jugend, many seeing combat for the first time, learned what Allied air superiority meant. Their columns were strafed and bombed. Their march became a series of short advances followed by long periods of concealment, waiting for darkness when they could resume movement with less risk. The panzers finally began arriving at the Normandy front on June 7 and 8, 36 to 48 hours after the invasion began. By then, the Allied beachhead had transformed from a vulnerable lodgment into a formidable defensive position. More than 160,000 Allied troops were ashore. Engineers had cleared beach obstacles and established supply routes. Artillery batteries were positioned and firing. Tank units had moved inland. The narrow window during which a concentrated armoured counterattack might have driven the Allies back into the sea had closed. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend reached its assembly area near Evrecy, south of Caen, late on June 6. But the Panther Battalion ran out of fuel east of the Orne River, victims of the disrupted supply lines that Allied air attacks had created. The division would not be ready for offensive operations until June 7. When it finally did attack, the Hitler Jugend engaged Canadian forces pushing toward Carpiquet airfield west of Cayenne. The fighting was brutal. The young SS soldiers, fanatical and well-trained, threw themselves into combat with reckless courage. But they were attacking piecemeal, without the concentrated force that might have achieved a breakthrough. Instead of a coordinated thrust by multiple panzer divisions striking simultaneously, The German counterattacks came in fragmented waves that Allied forces could defeat in detail. Panzer Lehr did not reach the front until June 8. General Bayerlein had watched his division suffer under relentless air attack during its approach march. When he finally deployed his forces, he found himself facing not disorganized troops, scrambling off landing craft, but dug-in British and American units, supported by naval artillery, tanks, and close air support. The battle Bayerlein fought bore no resemblance to the one Rundstedt had envisioned when he first requested these divisions be released. The moment for a decisive counterattack had passed while Hitler slept, and OKW staff hesitated to wake him. The consequence of the 12-hour delay cascaded through the entire Normandy campaign. Field Marshal Rommel, racing back to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, did not arrive until 9:30 in the evening on June 6. He immediately grasped that the situation was catastrophic. The Allies had established themselves ashore. The critical period during which they could have been thrown back had elapsed, while German commanders waited for permission to deploy forces they knew were necessary. Rommel began organizing what attacks he could with available forces, but he was improvising responses to a crisis rather than executing a coherent defensive plan. On June 7, Rommel attempted to organize a major armored thrust, using the 21st Panzer, elements of the 12th SS, and whatever other forces he could assemble. The goal was to rupture the Allied beachhead and drive toward the coast. But the attack was poorly coordinated, hampered by inadequate communications, devastated by Allied naval gunfire, and disrupted by British armoured advances scheduled for the same time frame. The confusion was total. German units attacked in different directions at different times. Allied firepower shattered the advances before they could develop momentum. By the end of June 7, Rommel understood that the opportunity to throw the Allies into the Channel had vanished. The numbers tell the story of what might have been. The 12th SS Panzer Division deployed to Normandy with approximately 20,500 men, over 150 tanks including Panthers and Panzer IVs, and full complement of support vehicles. Panzer Lehr arrived with similar strength, its 2 Panzer battalions equipped with Panthers and Panzer IVs, its Panzer Grenadier regiments entirely mechanized in armoured half-tracks. If these 2 divisions, plus the 21st Panzer already near Cayenne, had concentrated for a coordinated attack on June 6, while Allied forces were still establishing their positions on the beaches, the outcome of D-Day might have been different. Instead, these divisions were fed into battle piecemeal over several days, each arriving after Allied strength had grown, each attacking without proper coordination with other German units, each suffering under Allied air and naval bombardment that German forces could not counter. The 12th SS spent weeks fighting for Cayenne, gradually worn down in a battle of attrition they could not win. Panzer Lehr suffered catastrophic losses during Operation Cobra, the American breakout in late July. By the end of the Normandy campaign, both divisions had been reduced to fragments of their original strength. The historical record provides extensive documentation of the command failures on June 6. Historian Stephen Ambrose, drawing on German military archives and commander testimony, concluded that the only high command officer who responded correctly to the crisis at hand was Field Marshal Rundstedt. His reasoning was sound, his actions decisive, his orders clear. But the Panzer divisions were not under his command. They were under Hitler's personal control, and Hitler was sleeping while the fate of his Third Reich was being decided on the beaches of Normandy. British historian Ian Kershaw, in his biography of Hitler, documented the dictator's routine in the final years of the war. Hitler had become a nocturnal creature, staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning with his inner circle, discussing everything except the deteriorating military situation. He required drugs to function, amphetamines to energize him during the day, barbiturates to sleep at night. His adjutants had learned through bitter experience that waking him with incomplete information or unwelcome news brought only rage. They hesitated on the morning of June 6, uncertain whether the Normandy landings represented the real invasion or a diversion. By the time they finally woke him around noon, the moment for decisive action had passed. Rundstedt's biographer reached a stark conclusion. If Hitler had released the Panzer reserves as soon as Rundstedt had asked for them, the Allies would have experienced a much harder day on June 6 than they did. This assessment is supported by German staff studies conducted after the war and by Allied commanders' own evaluations. General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces, later acknowledged that concentrated German armor attacking the beaches on D-Day morning might have created a crisis. The Allied beachhead, particularly at Omaha Beach where American forces suffered terrible casualties fighting to get off the sand, was vulnerable during those first hours. A powerful armored thrust might not have driven the Allies back into the sea entirely, but it could have created sufficient delay to allow Germany to rush additional reinforcements to Normandy and establish a defensive line that would have been far more difficult to break. The fundamental problem was not military but political and psychological. By 1944, Hitler had created a command system that concentrated all decision-making authority in his person. No one else could act. Field marshals commanding millions of troops across multiple fronts could not maneuver divisions without permission from a single individual hundreds of miles away. And that individual had surrounded himself with staff officers who had learned that initiative was punished, that contradiction brought dismissal, that the safest course was always to wait for explicit orders rather than act on professional judgment. This paralysis was not unique to D-Day. Throughout the final years of the war, German military effectiveness was crippled by Hitler's insistence on controlling operational details that should have been left to commanders on the ground. In the Soviet Union, German armies were forbidden to conduct tactical withdrawals, even when encirclement was imminent, because Hitler had declared there would be no retreat. In Italy, commanders could not maneuver their forces without permission from far away. The pattern repeated endlessly. Professional soldiers with decades of experience waited for authorization from a dictator whose military judgment was increasingly impaired, but whose authority was absolute. On June 17, Hitler flew to France to meet with Rundstedt and Rommel at a command bunker near Soissons. Field marshals presented the same grim assessment. The situation in Normandy required either massive reinforcements that were not available or a rapid withdrawal to establish a more defensible line further inland. Remarkably, they both urged Hitler to find a political solution to end the war, which Rommel told him bluntly was unwinnable. Hitler ignored all their arguments. He demanded fanatical defense of every position and ordered counterattacks with whatever forces were available. No withdrawal was permitted. The armies in Normandy would hold where they stood and fight to the death if necessary. The consequences unfolded over the following weeks. German forces in Normandy, forbidden to conduct mobile defense or strategic withdrawal, were gradually ground down by Allied material superiority. American, British, and Canadian forces expanded their beachhead, brought ashore overwhelming quantities of men and equipment, and prepared for breakout operations that would shatter the German defensive line. The Panzer divisions that might have stopped the invasion on June 6 were instead consumed in weeks of attritional fighting that destroyed them as effective combat formations. In early July, Rundstedt was relieved of command after telling OKW staff that the only sensible course was to end the war. His replacement, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, arrived with optimistic assurances that the situation could be stabilized. Within weeks, von Kluge was sending the same desperate messages that had gotten Rundstedt dismissed. The situation was impossible. Allied air supremacy made movement in daylight suicidal. Naval gunfire shattered every counterattack near the coast. German troops were fighting with courage that bordered on desperation, but courage could not overcome the mathematical realities of material superiority. On July 17, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British fighter aircraft. Rommel suffered severe head injuries and was evacuated to Germany. 3 days later, German army officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted at his East Prussian headquarters. The plot failed, and the subsequent investigation revealed that Rommel had known about the conspiracy. Hitler offered him a choice: face trial and certain execution with disgrace to his family, or accept suicide disguised as death from his injuries. On October 14, 1944, Rommel took poison. The field marshal who had warned that the invasion had to be stopped on the beaches, who had tried to position panzers where they could respond immediately, who had been proven right by events, was dead by his own hand because he had finally acknowledged what everyone knew. Germany was losing the war Hitler had started. The Normandy campaign ground toward its conclusion in August 1944. Operation Cobra, the American breakout, shattered German defensive lines. Panzer Lehr division was virtually destroyed by carpet bombing and armoured assault. The 12th SS fought desperately to hold open an escape corridor near Falaise as German armies were encircled. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the Falaise pocket. The survivors retreated toward Germany, pursued by Allied forces whose momentum was now unstoppable. By late August, Paris had been liberated. By September, Allied armies were approaching the German border. The question that haunts the historical record is what might have happened if Hitler had authorized the Panzer deployment when Rundstedt first requested it. If the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr had moved at 3 a.m. on June 6, could they have reached the beaches while Allied forces were still vulnerable? The distance was roughly 120 miles. Under normal conditions, Panzer divisions could cover that ground in 6 to 8 hours. Moving in darkness and early morning overcast, they would have avoided the worst of Allied air attacks. They would have arrived at the coast between 10 in the morning and noon, while the beach landings were still in their critical phase. What they would have found was chaos, but chaos on both sides. Allied troops struggling to get off the beaches, particularly at Omaha where casualties were catastrophic. Supply dumps vulnerable and undefended. Command, structures still forming. A beachhead that extended perhaps a mile or two inland at its deepest point. Under these conditions, a coordinated attack by 2 elite Panzer divisions plus the 21st Panzer already engaging near Cayenne might have created a genuine crisis, not necessarily driving the Allies completely back into the sea, which may have been beyond German capability given Allied naval gunfire support, but certainly disrupting the landing schedule, delaying the consolidation of the beachhead, and forcing Allied commanders to commit reserves earlier than planned. Even a temporary disruption of the Allied timetable would have had strategic consequences. Every day the Normandy beachhead remained vulnerable was a day German reinforcements could arrive from elsewhere in France. The longer the Allies were confined to a narrow coastal strip, the more difficult their eventual breakout would become. A successful German counterattack on June 6 would not have prevented Allied victory in Normandy, but it might have delayed that victory by weeks or months, with cascading effects on the entire campaign. But this counterfactual analysis, while historically fascinating, misses the deeper significance of what happened on June 6. The 12-hour delay in deploying the Panzer reserves was not an isolated accident or a single bad decision. It was the inevitable product of the command system Hitler had created, a system where no one could act without explicit permission from the top, where professional soldiers with battlefield expertise had to wait for authorization from a political leader hundreds of miles away, where staff officers were too terrified of their dictator's temper to wake him even when the fate of the nation hung in the balance. This was not a military failure. It was a systemic failure, the collapse of command effectiveness that occurs when decision-making is centralized in a single individual who cannot be questioned, contradicted, or even awakened. German commanders in Normandy were not less competent than their Allied counterparts. Many were veterans with years of combat experience, but they operated within a structure that paralyzed initiative and punished independent action. The result was an army that could not respond effectively to crisis, because crisis response requires decentralized decision-making, the ability of commanders at every level to assess situations and act on their judgment without waiting for permission from far away. The Allied command structure, by contrast, was built on delegation of authority. Eisenhower set overall strategic objectives and allocated resources, but his army, corps, and division commanders had latitude to achieve those objectives through their own tactical decisions. When situations changed, Allied commanders adapted without needing to check with Supreme Headquarters. This flexibility gave the Allies a tempo of operations that German forces could not match. While German commanders waited for Hitler to make decisions about divisional deployments, Allied commanders were already exploiting opportunities and responding to threats. The technological dimension of the D-Day crisis compounded the command problem. By 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was total. German aircraft could not fly reconnaissance missions over southern England to determine where the invasion fleet was assembling. German radar stations along the coast were jammed or destroyed. The Luftwaffe had been bled white in the east and could not contest Allied control of the skies. This meant that when the invasion came, German commanders were operating blind, unable to get accurate real-time intelligence about Allied strength, objectives, or movements. Under these conditions, the prudent response would have been to delegate authority to commanders on the ground, trusting their judgment to deploy available forces as situations developed. Instead, Hitler had created a system that required referral of critical decisions up the chain of command to his personal approval. Combined with his nocturnal schedule and his staff's fear of waking him, this created guaranteed delay at exactly the moment when speed was essential. The 12 hours lost on June 6 were the price Germany paid for dictatorship. The legacy of the D-Day command failure extended beyond the Normandy campaign. Throughout the final year of the war, similar paralysis repeated in other theatres. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German forces achieved surprise and initial success with their Ardennes offensive. But when American resistance stiffened and the offensive stalled, German commanders needed permission from Hitler to adapt their plans or withdraw forces from untenable positions. Permission was denied. Units were ground down in attacks that had no chance of success because Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal. The pattern established on D-Day, where professional military judgment was overruled by political diktat, played out again and again until Germany's final defeat. In the Soviet Union, the consequences were even more catastrophic. German army groups were forbidden to retreat even when encirclement was certain. Hitler designated cities as fortresses that had to be held to the last man. Entire armies were destroyed because local commanders were not permitted to make tactical withdrawals that would have saved their forces. The command paralysis that lost 12 critical hours on D-Day cost hundreds of thousands of German lives on the Eastern Front. The human cost of Hitler's command system is difficult to calculate precisely, but easy to understand qualitatively. Professional soldiers who knew their craft were forced to execute orders they knew were wrong, leading men into battles they knew could not be won, because the alternative was court-martial and execution. The oath German officers swore was to Hitler personally, not to Germany or to the Constitution. This transformed military service into personal loyalty to a dictator whose strategic judgment was catastrophically flawed, but whose authority was enforced by the Gestapo and SS. The Allied victory in Normandy was not inevitable. The invasion was the most complex military operation ever attempted, requiring precise coordination across multiple services, accurate intelligence, technological innovation, and extraordinary courage from troops storming defended beaches. Any number of things could have gone wrong. Weather could have been worse, scattering the invasion fleet. German intelligence could have penetrated Allied deception operations, concentrating forces at Normandy instead of Calais. Rommel could have been at his headquarters instead of in Germany, enabling faster German response. The Atlantic Wall fortifications could have been more complete and more deadly. But given the command system under which German forces operated in 1944, Allied success became far more likely, not because German soldiers were less capable or less brave, but because the structure within which they fought hobbled their effectiveness. Initiative was punished. Independent judgment was forbidden. Commanders waited for permission that came too late or never came at all. The 12 hours lost while Hitler slept on June 6 symbolized the broader paralysis of German military command in the war's final phase. Field Marshal Rundstedt lived until 1953, dying in a British military hospital in Germany. He was never tried for war crimes, though accusations were made by multiple countries. Historians would debate his record, acknowledging his professional competence while questioning his service to an evil regime. On the morning of June 6, 1944, he made the right decision based on sound military judgment. The fact that his decision was overruled by Hitler's command system, that precious hours were lost while officers hesitated to wake their sleeping dictator, encapsulates the dysfunction that doomed German military effectiveness. The two Panzer divisions whose deployment was delayed, the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr, were eventually destroyed in the Normandy fighting. The 12th SS was rebuilt and fought in the Battle of the Bulge, before final destruction in Hungary in early 1945. Panzer Lehr was reconstituted multiple times, each rebuild weaker than the last, finally surrendering in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. These elite formations, which might have altered the course of D-Day if deployed when first requested, were consumed in months of attritional fighting that their delayed commitment made inevitable. The 21st Panzer Division, which did attack on D-Day but withdrew when reinforcements did not arrive, fought in Normandy until August. Caught in the Falaise Pocket, most of the division was destroyed. The survivors escaped encirclement and retreated into Germany, but the 21st Panzer as an effective combat formation ceased to exist. The one division that responded immediately on June 6 lasted longer than the two held in reserve, but its fate was ultimately the same: destruction in a campaign that Germany could not win once the decisive moment had passed. General Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st Panzer, survived the war and faced trial by Nazi authorities in 1944 for corruption and cowardice, charges that were politically motivated. His death sentence was commuted by Hitler's personal intervention. After the war, Feuchtinger was pressured by Soviet intelligence into spying on West German rearmament. He died in 1960, his reputation damaged by both his wartime performance and his post-war betrayal. The broader lesson of June 6, 1944 extends beyond military history into the study of organizational effectiveness and decision-making systems. Centralizing authority in a single individual creates bottlenecks that become catastrophic during crisis. Staff cultures that punish bearers of bad news guarantee that leaders will not have accurate information when they need it most. Command systems that require permission for every significant action cannot respond to rapidly changing situations. These principles, demonstrated by Germany's D-Day disaster, apply to any organization facing complex challenges under time pressure. The Allied invasion succeeded because of many factors: superior material resources, technological advantages, better intelligence, courageous soldiers, and competent commanders. But it also succeeded because the German response was hobbled by a command system that could not function effectively when the crisis came. Rundstedt made the right call at 3 a.m. on June 6. OKW staff should have woken Hitler immediately or authorized the deployment on their own authority. The Panzer divisions should have moved, while darkness still provided concealment. None of this happened because the system was broken, paralyzed by centralized control and authoritarian command culture. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, more than 160,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy. The beachhead was established and expanding. German forces had failed to mount the coordinated counterattack that might have driven the invaders back. The opportunity was lost, not in the fighting on the beaches, but in the 12 hours of paralysis while Hitler slept and German commanders waited for permission they should never have needed. The fate of Fortress Europe was sealed not by Allied heroism, though there was plenty of that, but by German dysfunction, by a command system that had replaced professional military judgment with personal loyalty to a dictator who was sleeping while his empire began to crumble. The numbers tell part of the story. Allied casualties on D-Day were approximately 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing. German casualties were perhaps 1,000, but the Germans had lost something more important than men. They had lost time. The 12 hours between Rundstedt's initial request and Hitler's belated authorization was time the Allies used to consolidate their beachhead, time that turned a vulnerable landing into an established position, time that could never be recovered. In war, timing is everything, and on the longest day, while the fate of Europe hung in the balance, the German command system failed at the most critical moment because no one dared wake Hitler. This is the documented story, verified through military records, commander testimony, and historical analysis, of how bureaucratic paralysis and command dysfunction transformed D-Day from a battle that might have gone either way into an Allied victory that changed the course of the war. It demonstrates that military effectiveness depends not just on soldiers and equipment, but on command systems that enable rapid decision-making and reward professional judgment. It reveals how authoritarian leadership, by concentrating all authority in one person and creating a culture of fear around that person, guarantees disaster when crisis demands immediate action. The Panzers that might have made a difference sat idle near Paris while Allied troops stormed ashore. They moved only when it was too late, arriving after the moment for decisive counterattack had passed. The German commanders, who understood what needed to be done, could not act without permission. And the one man whose permission was required was sleeping, surrounded by staff too frightened to wake him, while history turned on the delay. On June 6, 1944, Germany lost not just a battle but the war, not through military defeat on the beaches, but through command paralysis that revealed the fatal weakness at the heart of Hitler's regime. The 12 hours lost that morning could never be recovered, and by the time Hitler finally gave his permission, the Allied beachhead was secure, the invasion was succeeding, and the Third Reich's last chance to prevent the liberation of Europe had vanished while its dictator slept. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.